Good afternoon, everyone. Stephen Kelly from Manufacturing Northern Ireland. Today is an opportunity to learn more about the UK's internal market scheme, and I'm joined by both Shanker Singham and Doreen Crawford from TSS. It's an opportunity to understand why the scheme might be relevant for you and your business and what actions you should be taking in the days and weeks ahead in terms of registering for that scheme and getting the most and maximising the benefits that that scheme has for you as traders importing goods from Great Britain into Northern Ireland. We have a series of slides and we'll also have a question and answer. So if you do have a question that you'd like, please put it either in the chat, but particularly put it into the question and answer button that's available, because colleagues from TSS will be able to answer those directly for you as the webinar continues on. We will be recording this session, so feel free to avoid taking notes at this point in time, but we'll share both the slides and the recording after the event should you wish to watch it again at your leisure. I'll hand over now to colleagues Shanker Singham and Doreen Crawford, as I said, from TSS. Take us through the slides, and then I'll come back online again whenever we do the questions and answers. Shanker, Doreen, over to you.
Thank you very much, Stephen, and it's a real pleasure to do this for Manufacturing Northern Ireland, and it's a real pleasure, Stephen, to be on with you again. We've worked on these issues for many years now, so yeah, good to see you again. So Doreen and I will do the presentation. I'll do the first sort of half of it, and she'll do the second half. We've got some colleagues from TSS, from the Institute of Exports and International Trade, on with us: Rachel Green, Christine Prigo, and Magdalene Gibson. And if you have questions, if you put those in the chat, then my colleagues will do their best to answer those as you have them. But we want to have a sort of interactive session as well, and answer any questions that you have at the end of the deck, and we will certainly make this deck available to you through Stephen once we have finished. So just a quick agenda. This is the second UKIMS webinar that we actually did as a TSS webinar. The first UKIMS webinar, the introduction, and an original webinar on the Windsor Framework. Those are available on the NICTA website. So we'd encourage you certainly to go to the NICTA website. A lot of information, a lot of FAQs, this type of thing is all available on the NICTA website for you. And so just to put the UKIMS, the UK Internal Market Scheme, in context, obviously the Windsor Framework allows traders to benefit in a number of ways. If you are a trader who knows that your goods are going to stay in the UK customs territory, going to stay in Northern Ireland before the movement, there will be a process benefit that will be coming. The so-called customs green lane, which will be live September 2024. That is distinct from what you are all anticipating in October of this year, like in a few days, which is the Northern Ireland Retail Movement Scheme, the NIRM scheme, which is a DEFRA scheme for SBS goods, and the plant scheme, the NIFLS scheme, which both of those go live October 1st. Now, there are some customs-related aspects to those schemes that we can discuss if people are interested in having that discussion. But in order to avail yourself of the customs green lane, the process simplifications, and the other benefits, the particularly the fiscal benefits of movements inside the customs territory, you do need to be registered on UKIMS. And so what we'll do is we'll talk about UKIMS, we'll talk about the scheme you're probably familiar with, which is the UK Trader Scheme, which was the equivalent scheme under the Northern Ireland Protocol. UKIMS is the equivalent scheme to UKTS, although it's slightly broader and more enhanced for the Windsor Framework. So if we go to the next slide. Just a little bit about the speakers today. I think most people know me. Doreen Crawford is a stakeholder engagement manager for the consortium. She's a trade specialist with over 25 years of experience. She's worked in industry, and she's been a stalwart member of the TSS consortium since it's really its inception. If we go to the next slide. So what is UKIMS and how do I use it? And I will cover the first two blocks there, and then I'll hand over to Doreen to talk about next steps and some common themes that are emerging from UKIMS applications. So if we go to the next slide. So what is the UK Internal Market Scheme? First of all, you will be very familiar with the UK Trader Scheme, which is the scheme that originally provided the fiscal benefit for, quotes, not at risk trade. Now, not at risk trade under the Northern Ireland Protocol had a purely fiscal meaning, in other words, not at fiscal risk. And if you were on the UK Trader Scheme, you could benefit from the fact that you didn't have to worry about the tariff that might apply to your movements from GB to NI. If you were moving at risk and you weren't on the UK Trader Scheme, then you would be subject to the applicable EU tariff. That could be a zero tariff if you were operating under the UK Trade and Cooperation Agreement and your goods were covered by the rules of origin in that agreement, or it could be a zero tariff if the European Common External Tariff was zero. But in other cases, you would be subject to the EU tariff. So the UKTS enabled you not to be subject to any applicable EU tariff. The UK Internal Market Scheme, it goes a bit beyond this. It gives you not only the fiscal benefits of not having to pay the duty, it also gives you process benefits. And we talked in our original Windsor Framework webinar, which is on the NICTA website, about what those benefits are. And essentially they are a much simplified customs process. So you're not doing an international customs declaration. You are putting some data in, and the data is typically available from the commercial documentation, invoice, and so on, and also the shipping documentation. And to the extent there are additional data fields, if you are on UKTS, all traders will get or could get a trader goods profile. If you're on UKTS, then HMRC is planning to repopulate that for UKIMS traders who were UKTS with your existing information, so that simplifies the process even further for you. UK Internal Market Scheme is enhanced and expanded on. I'll come to that. I see there's a hand up, Bernadette. We probably should go through the slides and then go into Q&A, but if you have a quick question now, I'm happy to take that.
No, Shanker, if we can continue on with the presentation. Bernadette,
Okay.
if you could put your questions into the Q&A at the end, we'll make sure we get to that. Thanks.
Great. So let's go to the next slide, please. So what are the UKIMS benefits? I mean, essentially, UKIMS benefits are financial benefits. And here we've got to be very clear that there is the green lane you will be hearing a lot about at the moment is the NIRMS, the DEFRA green lane for SPS goods that are moving from GB to Northern Ireland, which comes on stream October 1st, 2023. That is distinct from the process benefits of what's called the customs green lane. It's a customs simplification, process simplification that is going to be available from September 2024. So we'd encourage you to look at this as a process of a series of benefits that will be coming in from the 1st of October onwards through September 2024. With the culmination of the customs process simplification. But what's going to happen on October 1st, 2023 is the NIRMS green lane. So and the NIFLS green lane. So in other words, the SPS food, the retail movement scheme, and the plant scheme. Now from September 23, from now, there are UKIMS financial benefits that I mentioned. So, for example, no duty if you're entering Northern Ireland from free circulation in GB. If your goods have entered GB in free circulation, you then move them to Northern Ireland, there will not be a duty that will be applicable. That is as things were under the UK trader scheme. The UK duty will be applicable if you're entering Northern Ireland from rest of the world. So, and this is important because at the beginning of the protocol, obviously, as when the UK initially left the EU, the UK duty schedule, the tariff schedule, and the EU tariff schedule were the same. Now the UK has diverged. It's diverged through its own global tariff that it's adopted. It's diverging because of the trade agreements it's doing. Australia, New Zealand, we have CPTPP accession coming. So the UK duty is going to change, and it's going to, in broad terms, be much lower than the EU duty. So if you're entering goods into Northern Ireland from rest of world, and you know that they're staying in Northern Ireland ahead of the movement, there's a real benefit of that differential between the UK duty and the EU duty. The 3% collar remains in place. In other words, if the duty is bigger than 3%, then you won't get a fiscal benefit there. But up to 3%, there will be a benefit. And if you're entering Northern Ireland from GB and the goods weren't in free circulation, again, the UK duty would be applicable. So those are the fiscal benefits of UKIMS. Come September 2024, there will be additional process benefits that I alluded to. So goods that are moving on the red lane where the trader does not know where the goods are going before the movement, what has historically been an at-risk movement, those will be subject to full customs process and international customs declaration. Goods that are on the simplified customs process from September 2024 will not be subject to an international customs process. They will have a simplified data set that generally you will be filling in before the movement. And that is going to mean that there will be no requirement for a customs declaration as soon as this lane is in place in September 2024. So the supplementary declaration, which I know has caused traders lots of difficulty, that will go for this particular customs green lane. So again, encourage you to take advantage of that. And the way to take advantage of that is to register for UKIMS now, to make your application now. It is important to point out that the UK trader scheme will be replaced by UKIMS on the 1st of October 2024, which means that if you were on the UKTS, you were benefiting from the duty benefit, then in order to continue to benefit from the fiscal fiscal benefit, you need to be registered on UKIMS. I think HMRC has talked about, if you register by the end of July, they can not guarantee, but they can pretty much, you can be pretty satisfied that you will be on the scheme when you need to be. In terms of how long it's taking, it varies a lot depending on the application, but typically 2 to 3 weeks depending on the volume. So our advice now is that July date was not a deadline. It was not the end of the story. You can continue to register for UKIMS at any point, and we strongly encourage traders to do exactly that. So those are the benefits that will be coming. If we go to the next slide. So what are the differences? I mentioned that UKIMS was an enhanced scheme, a broader scheme than UKTS. Well, first of all, the rules on UKTS, and I'm talking about the permanent rules of the protocol. I mean, I'm aware that there were some temporary easements, but those were, as I say, temporary. The establishment rule has changed so that initially under UKTS, only businesses with physical premises in Northern Ireland could be registered. Now all businesses, GB, all Northern Ireland, can be registered. So it may well be that you, depending on the terms of trade that you have, it may well be that your GB supplier is the appropriate person to be registered for UKIMS. So another sort of takeaway from this is for if you think this may apply to you, and you may be able to get the benefits, it is important for the whole supply chain, for the Northern Ireland consignee receiver, the GB consignor or sender of goods, and the haulier you're using are aligned on what process you intend to use. Um, uh, the turnover threshold for the processing exemption has changed. So any trader can be on UKIMS, as any trader could be on UKTS, subject to a processing exemption. Subject to a processing, exception to the rule. So if you were a processor historically, you could not be on UKTS unless you were in one of the exemptions. And one of those exemptions is the small processor exemption. That was £500,000 as a threshold. That threshold has gone up to £2 million. So if you are a small processor and that threshold and your turnover is less than £2 million, you can be in the small processor exemption. If you are not in the small processor exemption, then you may still be in an exemption for certain businesses above the threshold. So these would be things like food, construction, animal feed, and so on. And we'll talk about what those are in a second. The exemptions have been expanded to include one subsequent entity in the supply chain. This is quite an important exemption. I want to highlight and underscore this, and we will be talking about it more specifically from UKTS. One of the problems I think we encountered with traders who were applying to be on the UK trader scheme, who were trying to avail themselves of the processing exemptions, was that the rule in the protocol was any goods subject to processing could not be included in the UKTS. And so these exemptions are important because they provide that if you're selling to one subsequent entity in the supply chain, you can still benefit from the exemption to the processing rule. And that is quite, we think that will be quite a significant expansion of the program. So if we go to the next slide, please. Yeah, we're going to do the slides first, and then we'll come to Q&A. But if you put your question in the chat or in the Q&A, our team will answer them. Who can apply? Traders can apply. Again, you have to be established in the UK, can be GB, can be Northern Ireland, and you need to meet compliance requirements. This is a trusted trader scheme in line with other trusted trader schemes, and therefore there are some compliance requirements. You need to you need to make sure that if you're authorized under other HMRC programs that you haven't lost your authorization for failure to comply. Your financial systems need to comply. You need to be in good standing and all the rest of those things. You also need to meet record holding requirements. So you need to have systems, controls, evidence requirements, so you can actually attest to the fact that your goods stay in the customs territory of the UK. There isn't a rule on how complex or how sophisticated those record keeping requirements need to be. You could have a Excel spreadsheet, you could have a very sophisticated software tool, Any of those things are fine. The only thing that is important is that whatever you say in your application that you're going to use to ensure that you know that goods stay in the UK customs territory, that needs to be what you actually use, because there may be a audit in the future, in which case you'll have to sort of say that this is what you've done, and it has to be consistent with your UKIMS application. And then processors can also apply for UKIMS. Again, if you're in the small processor area, which is a turnover of less than 2 million, and that is for the business that is the UKIMS applicant. So if it's a GB supplier that's the applicant, it's their turnover. If it's a Northern Ireland entity that's the applicant, then it'll be their turnover. Or if you're not a small processor, you need to be moving goods in those sectoral exemptions that I talked about. And to repeat, those are that they haven't changed from the previous UKTS. So they are animal feed, healthcare, construction, not-for-profit, and food. And for all the sectors, food, you need to be selling to a consumer-facing facility like a supermarket, for example. But for the other sectors, there is an additional benefit, which is you can sell your goods to one subsequent entity, and if you do, you can be eligible for UKIMS. I would also point out for processors that you may well be, even though you're a processor, you may well be bringing in other goods. You may be bringing in other finished goods just in the course of your ordinary business from GB. And of course, those are completely covered by UKIMS, and you should register yourself for UKIMS in respect of those other goods. So if we go to the next slide, please. So how does it work? And I'm going to talk about, first of all, the journey that you can expect from 1st of October, or frankly from now. If you are UKIMS authorized, you will get a UKIMS number from HMRC that will be verified on your TSS profile. You will raise the goods movement with TSS in the way that you do now, and goods will be approved for movement from GB to Northern Ireland in the way that they are now, and you'll move those goods from GB to Northern Ireland, and you'll do your supplementary declaration using NIREM, but in conjunction with your UKIMS number. And so I'd point out that, again, the customs, the simplified process that we talked about, the simplified data set, that comes in September 2024. So there's a period between now and September 2024 when if you're using UKIMS, you continue to do it to get the fiscal benefit. And what I would say is use the time between now and the customs process benefit being available to identify whether that's something that you would you could actually use, and to talk to your supply chain, talk to your GB supplier, talk to your hauliers about how it would work, because there's information that the haulier will have in order to do this, and there's information that the traders will have in order to do all the necessary documentation prior to the movement, so that you don't actually have to do anything after the movement. If we go to the next slide, please. So goods subject to processing if the turnover is over 2 million, the sectoral exemptions we talked about, just to repeat those: construction, where the processed good forms a permanent part of a structure that is constructed and located in Northern Ireland, or, as the asterisk shows, if you sell the goods onto one subsequent entity that does that in the supply chain. Same for animal feed, but final use of animal feed has to be on premises in Northern Ireland. But you could be bringing in products that are processed, that go to a subsequent entity that processes them into animal feed, provided final use of the feed is on premises in Northern Ireland. Food hasn't changed. It's still for sale to end consumers in Northern Ireland. What has changed is that that is a broader group of people now. So it is not just supermarkets. It is also food service, schools, hospitals, other entities like that. And then healthcare, directly providing health or care services in Northern Ireland. And again, subject to the asterisk, you can, as a processor, sell onto one subsequent entity in the supply chain. Not-for-profit activities in Northern Ireland where there's no subsequent sale of the processed goods. If we go to the next slide, please. So what does this mean for me as a trader? Suppose we got a couple of examples here. Suppose that the trader imports sports clothing into Northern Ireland. It could be any product. We'll just use that as an example. The goods would be subject to duty if they were moving into the EU. They're not at risk of moving into the EU if you know that they are remaining in Northern Ireland. So you could be UKIMS authorised in that case. And Erin, our trader here, has her UKIMS authorisation, so she can use NIREM on her declaration and she doesn't pay any duty. If she's not UKIMS, if Linda, the other trader here, isn't UKIMS authorised, they're not zero. There will be an applicable duty because she can't use NIREM, she can't claim a zero duty. Now that applicable duty might be zero if the EU Common External Tariff is zero, or if she's able to benefit because the goods themselves satisfy the rules of origin under the TCA. So she might be able to benefit in that way. But she may, if those two don't apply, she'll be paying an EU duty. What has changed and what is now available to traders is the duty reimbursement scheme, which HMRC has made available to traders. So even if she does pay a duty, if she is able to say, once the goods have moved into Northern Ireland, that they stay in Northern Ireland, and she's able to evidence the fact that the goods stay in Northern Ireland, then she may be able to use the duty reimbursement scheme to reclaim that duty. But clearly there's a cash flow dimension to this, and therefore you would always be better off getting on UKIMS if you qualify for it. And I would also add that if you're on UKIMS, when the process simplifications come on stream in September 2024, obviously the UKIMS trader will benefit. The person who's not UKIMS authorized will not be able to benefit from that. So if we go to the next slide. So I'll talk very briefly about the transition from UKTS to UKIMS, what that looks like, before handing over to Doreen for next steps. So if we go to the next slide, please. So when does this change happen? You can do it now. UKIMS has been available since June. HMRC has said, as I mentioned before, that if you do this application by the 30th of July, you can be very confident that you'll have it available before the UKTS is replaced. That doesn't mean that that's a deadline, or if you've missed that deadline, you can't do anything. It simply means you need to get your application in as soon as possible. So, obviously from the 30th of September, UKIMS replaces UKTS. There will be no UKTS scheme. There will be no scheme to benefit from a zero tariff from the 30th of September other than the UKIMS scheme. So you must be on it. So we would say, to traders, if you're not on the scheme and you think you qualify, you must apply as soon as you possibly can. We can certainly help you through that. September 2024, that is when the customs green lane, the customs process simplifications come into effect, and you can only gain access to them if you are UKIMS registered. And so there's a tariff benefit from the 30th of September, and then there is both the tariff benefit and the process benefit from September 2024. There'll be two classes of traders. There'll be existing UKTS traders who are transferred onto UKIMS. If you were a or if you are a UKTS trader and you have not heard from anybody about this, you should have heard already from HMRC. But please, if you haven't applied to UKIMS, please do so again ASAP. And you might be a newly eligible trader. So I talked about the differences between UKTS and UKIMS. You may have been rejected from the UKTS, and you may actually qualify for UKIMS now. So if you've been rejected from UKTS, maybe because your turnover was 1.7 million, let's say, or because you sold to a subsequent entity and you were caught by the goods subject to processing rule. If you're not caught by this anymore, you might be eligible for UKIMS. Do take advantage of that enhancement and make the application. All right, so if we go to the next slide. So what happens if you're not UKIMS authorized? So here's Bob, our non-UKIMS authorized trader. He's UKTS registered, but he's not applied for UKIMS. So Bob has been using the benefit of UKTS. He's been declaring not at risk. He's been using the NIREM code from the 30th of September when UKIMS replaces UKTS. He cannot use UKIMS because he's obviously not applied. There is no auto transfer. You have to actually apply for UKIMS. I think that has been a confusion in the past, but you must apply. And you have to be UKIMS authorized in order to declare goods not at risk from September 2023. So what will happen to Bob is he will receive his goods in the normal way, but he will have to pay applicable duty. He cannot declare goods are not at risk. However, all is not lost. He may be eligible to claim the duty reimbursement, but there are evidential rules for that. So he'll have to be able to prove that the goods remained in Northern Ireland. So if we go to the next slide. So essentially, it's not too late to apply. HMRC is still processing applications. They are processing them as quickly as possible, but it does take time. This is not going to be, an overnight, thing. So obviously do not wait until the 29th of September. I mean, if you haven't done it already, do it now. And the sooner you apply, the sooner you can claim the fiscal benefit. So if there's an interregnum kind of period where you're not on UKIMS, you were on UKTS, you've applied, and you get on UKIMS in the future, for that intervening period, you can use reimbursement, but save yourself the trouble, get on UKIMS as soon as you can. And then if we go to the next slide. So I'm going to hand over now to Doreen to just go over next steps. And also we've now had the benefit of seeing some of the UKIMS applications. So we know some of the problems people have been having, and we can walk you through those as well. So Doreen, do you want to take over from now?
Yes, thank you. And I would encourage people to keep the questions coming in. I am actually going to keep some of these for later on when we take the Q&As live, because some of them are really good and we want to expand on some of the statements or questions you've asked in the chat function and the Q&A function. So back to today. So what are my next steps for your UKIMS application? What do you need to do? And if you've already started the process, what additional information can we give you? So next slide, please. Okay, so if you haven't started your application, you can do that today by going to gov.uk. And I really encourage you, if you are applying for UKIMS, if you haven't already, read the application and understand all the guidance that's given within that. So this is a trusted trader scheme, and you will be asked to add quite a lot of information to your application, and also retain and supply evidence to support the use of the scheme after you have moved your goods. So if at any point during the application process you are stuck or want additional information, you can contact us directly at TSS. Or we have actually loaded quite a lot of information into our Northern Ireland Customs and Trade Academy website. And we have video, we have a walk through the form, we have frequently asked questions. And you also can contact HMRC directly with some of your questions as well. But if you really do want to spend some time and ask more detailed questions, support it. If you're using the TSS, the portal will look very familiar to you. Just create a new case and someone will reach out to you, or just call through to the help, the call center, and again, we can raise the case that way as well. Next slide, please. Some people get a lot of feedback on what happens to my application, how do I track it, etc. Now, there is no tracking service with this application, but HMRC has stood up resources to process these as quickly as possible. And again, when you're filling in the application, we would encourage you to give as much information as possible. And if you're unsure, reach out for some additional guidance, because that will ensure that the time it takes to approve your application goes very as smoothly as possible. So again, submit your information to HMRC, they will process it, and we do know that they are approving these quite quickly from, depending on the quality of the information, anything from 24 to 48 hours up to a week if there's some additional information being required, but they are doing that as quickly as possible due to volumes. If there's something on your application that they would like some additional information, they will reach out and ask you for additional information. They will not reject your application unless they reach out and ask you to add additional. If you're unsure when they reach back out to you what to do, again, I would encourage you to use the resources we've set up at the Trader Support Service or directly with the HMRC to help you complete and update that application and submit it again to HMRC. Next slide, please. So we have worked with HMRC, and in our prior webinar, we had someone from lovely Amy Breen on with us as well to take us through a lot of the questions that were being asked and the additional information HMRC was sending back to applicants. So I'm going to share that with you now today. So next slide, please. So there's 4 common mistakes we wanted to just highlight to applicants, and it's around the areas business details, people with significant control of the business, additional requirements for processing, which I'm assuming this is going to be a topic that you're sort of going to want to hear today, and record systems, controls, and evidence. So the form, I'm sure you are glad to know, is one of those forms that you can save as you go along and then go back to. One of the key points I want to remind everyone is when you have completed this process, please remember to hit the submit button. You will get an email with a reference number, and that's your way to know that HMRC has received that submitted application. Next slide, please. So the most common mistake is actually incorrect company information. So HMRC will cross-reference the information you fill out in this form with other HMRC systems, and one of those is going to be the information in Company House. So please ensure that the information in Company House is up to date and matches the information on your application form. If there's discrepancies, HMRC will return the form to you, highlighting this as information is incorrect. Next slide, please. And again, this rolls into persons with significant control. HMRC will check who is registered in Company House as directors or within other systems within HMRC. And if those details are not up to date or match your application form, these will also create some delays in processing their application. Another area here is around who is responsible for the movement of goods. And we are getting quite a lot of questions around here, people saying that it's the haulier or is it my carrier? They're not quite sure, but it's actually who organises your logistics supply chain. It may not be your director in your business, it may be someone else, or you may employ a third party. Again, it's just given HMRC who that person is within this application form. So who actually controls how your goods move? Next slide, please. And again, this is the processing piece. And Shanker touched on it earlier on, the definition of processing and what additional requirements are needed under UKIMS. So the definition of processing under the NI Windsor Framework is the same as it was under the Northern Ireland Protocol. It hasn't changed, and basically it is goods that has anything done to them other than being relabeled or reboxed. And again, that definition is in the legal text. So as manufacturers, we always think we kind of, what is processing? Is assembly the same as processing, etc.? Well, under the requirements here, it is any change or any addition to the materials that you bring in. And I'm sure Stephen has the definition himself. So when you are actually filling in the form, we want to make sure that in the sections of the form it asks you about processing. It will ask you if you are a processor, and please give as much information as possible of how you actually process the goods. Do you paint them? Do you, I see a lot of questions in the chat about steel cutting and forming, etc. So as much information as possible to how you process your materials into your finished products is required to give HMRC some kind of understanding of your business, and explain the type of goods that you'll be moving and also how you move those goods and your role in the supply chain. And again, you may actually bring the goods in and then you do additional processing off-site, bring them back, and then you move your goods to your final customer. Again, HMRC wants to know those details because under this trusted trader scheme, it is you as the processor is actually, and the operative of this authorization are actually holding the records and the evidence that you meet all of the criteria and hold all the records that these goods remain in the internal market. So that bit's really important. How do you prove that the goods remain in the internal market once you've processed them? Next slide, please. So again, I want to just touch here on the records and the evidence that are provided for records. Some businesses are very complex and some businesses are very simple. And the record keeping can be as simple or as complex as the business models. So you need as much information as possible to meet the requirements of the application and the authorization. So if you use specific software for ordering your raw materials and warehousing them, your production records, and then your sales, give HMRC what kind of software that you actually use and how you use it within your business. You don't have to tell them everything, but if you have internal processes, you can reference them to support it. Tell them how you track the goods from import to final sale or use. So again, it's just that they're cradle to grave process through your business and how you actually support that. And also how you back up that information if you were asked to produce it to HMRC to ensure that you're following the guidance and the criteria of the authorization. And again, it's do you back it up in the cloud? Do you keep it in a separate server? Do you keep hard copies? And again, this is whatever fits in with your current business model to meet the criteria of this scheme. So we have a little example there of George, but that's not really apply to you guys for a restaurant in Belfast. But again, it's just showing you that it can be as simple or as complex as possible. If we can actually go back one slide there. One of the common mistakes that we make, or one of the questions that we get within the trader support services, is from people who process, manufacturers who process goods, say we don't qualify. And that may be you don't meet the criteria for the goods that you actually process, but you may meet it for other goods. Like if you bring in finished goods, or if you bring in like your production consumables, things like that, they will qualify for UKIMS, and you can make those savings on the duty moving into Northern Ireland if they're consumed through in your production processes on site in Northern Ireland. So again, it's just keeping mindful, it's not just your finished goods. There may be other goods that this will apply to that you haven't thought about. Can we skip back to next slide and then the one after? Okay, so that's some of the things that I wanted to kind of go through there. And there's one other point I would really like to make here. So this scheme is, a lot of misconceptions are that the trader support service and this scheme is something that we run. It's actually an HMRC scheme. So you need to apply for it in its own and use it in conjunction with the declarations that you put through the trader support service if you use us. And also it's a trusted trader scheme. So that means that to be approved on it, you must know where your products are going at the end. So if you know if your goods are moving from, or your materials are moving from GB to Northern Ireland, and you know before they move that the goods are remaining in Northern Ireland, and you meet all the other criteria, this scheme is going to benefit you. So it's having that proof of where these goods end up. I'm sorry, I just wanted to underscore that because I kind of got a little feel from some of the questions around the scheme that, you know, I just want to underline that point. It's where do you hold the proof of where the goods end up once you've processed them? Thanks, carry on.
And Doreen, we may come back to that because I know for many traders, they're in the supply chain of other businesses. So how far do you travel? How much information do you actually know about the final destination of those goods, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So we may come to that. There's a number of questions in the question and answer box, which we'll go to first, and then I know there's some in the chat function because the Q&A wasn't available for everyone for some reason. But we will get around to all those questions, even if we're here until 9 o'clock tonight. I hope not, but we'll get around to all of these questions. The first one's actually on a tariff one, so I don't know about yourself or Shanker. There appears to be some confusion in that the HMRC website is suggesting if the UK tariff is less or equal to the EU tariff, then goods are not at risk and the UK tariff applies. Conversely, there's a suggestion that if goods are at risk of moving to the EU due to uncertainty, then the EU tariff applies. If that is less than the UK tariff by 3%. This kind of question around which tariff applies potentially is causing some confusion for people. Can we have a very simple definition? I know certainly in your slides earlier, Shanker, you were talking about the under the scheme the UK tariff applies and the rest of the world stuff. So on that tariff one, which tariff applies? Can I clarify and clean that up for people?
So the general case where there's a difference between the UK and the EU tariff, we'll be talking about rest of world trade going into Northern Ireland. And if that rest of world trade goes into Northern Ireland on an at-risk basis in the way that it does, you know, now, but basically if you don't know that it's staying in Northern Ireland, then the EU tariff will apply. If you do know that it's going into Northern Ireland, staying in Northern Ireland, then in general terms, the UK tariff will apply, and the UK tariff generally will be lower than the EU tariff. I don't think there's any case where it's higher. But there is an exception to that, which is this 3% collar, which applied before the Windsor Framework and continues to apply now. So if the differential, if the UK tariff is more than 3 points lower than the EU tariff, then you won't be able to use the UKIMS scheme for the tariff benefit. You won't be able to use NIREM to claim the UK tariff. You'll be subject to the EU tariff. Now, similarly, there are certain products that are subject to trade remedies, that are subject to TRQs. There's a kind of exception to the exception there for particular categories of steel. 2 categories of steel for the steel traders on here, steel 7 and 17, where there's a Northern Ireland TRQ that applies. So you don't have to draw down the European TRQ, tariff rate quota. In that case, you rely on the special Northern Ireland TRQ. But other than that, if you're subject to a tariff rate quota, or you're subject to a trade remedy, for example, you can't benefit from UKIMS, and you will be paying the EU tariff.
Thanks, Shanker. Second question here from Stephen McKillop. We're a manufacturer of steel fabrications. We buy steel, cut and folded, fabricated, painted, assemble it with other components, and sell the complete finished item to our customers. Are we classified as a processor or not? We do not fall into the processor criteria as defined by your previous webinar, so I'm unsure what that last element of it was, but just, Doreen, maybe just to kind of reiterate what is viewed as being a commercial processor.
Yeah, so it is processing under the guidance here. Just to, and I know this, I'm going to read it just word for word, but we'll explain it, okay? So, commercial processing under the terms of the Windsor Framework and previously the Northern Ireland Protocol is for the purposes of the paragraph which it talks to. Processing means any alteration of goods, any transformation of goods in any way, or any subjecting of goods to operations other than for the purpose of preserving them in good condition, or for adding, affixing marks, labels, seals, or any other documentation to ensure compliance with any specific requirements. So in normal man speak, layman's terms, that means that processing is whatever you do is going to be deemed a processing unless you are repairing something and to keep it operational. So repairing your machine and bring it back to its original working condition. Or if you're putting a label in something or putting additional documentation in it, like a manual or something like that, then that will not be processing. Anything else, Stephen, is processing. So unless you're putting it back into a workable condition under the repairs, and there is definitions of repairs, or if you're putting a label on it, putting a leaflet in it, or putting a manual in it, anything else is going to be processing.
Great, and it kind of helps then with the next question, which is in our Q&A. In your presentation, you talked about businesses will bring in items for exclusive consumption within that business.
Yeah.
So my example of this is tea bags for the tea room. So where
Use
things are
UKIMS.
being brought in.
Yes.
Where things are being brought in for consumption by the staff or within your business, just as a normal paper for your photocopier, etc., etc., etc. Those can be UKIMS, but where you're bringing in things and creating it into another product that potentially is at risk of going to the EU, then that isn't UKIMS. So our advice to every manufacturer is that UKIMS is actually for you as well, even if it's only just to bring your tea bags in for the staff room, or pens for your offices, or toilet rolls for the hygiene facilities, etc., etc., etc. There are things where you can use UKIMS, even if you are quite clearly a commercial processor and quite clearly goods are at risk of going into the EU market. So I think that kind of clears up Richard McFeeder's question, which is in the Q&A. If not, Richard, we can come back to that.
It's things like, sorry, Stephen, I want to expand on that just slightly further, other than office stuff. You know, the things like if you're running production equipment and you have the oil and lubricants and you have the cleaners and you have the spare parts for those machines and the maintenance of those machines, all of that can be brought in. And used under UKIMS because it's going to the repair and the maintenance and the running of the machines on site in Northern Ireland. So they're not going into the products. I know they're being used to create the products, but the actual usage of that is actually to keep your machines running and your factories going. It's not going into the final product. So again, that's why I specifically pulled out the phrasing production consumables.
Yep.
And non-production consumables make the difference there. And if it's a non-production consumable, then you can use UKIMS if you have the evidence that it is not going into your final product.
And I would also, just to build on that, I would just stress that the UKIM, the process we're talking about here, is a two-stage process. So you can have your UKIMS registration. You then have to do something in order to, on your declaration between now and September 2024, before the process simplifications come in. But you, right now, you need to use NIREM. So there may be some products that you will be using NIREM for, such as the ones that Doreen talked about, while as a processor for the things that you process, you may not be able to.
Thanks both for that. There's a
One more
question
point.
here.
Sorry, Stephen,
Sorry, go ahead.
I apologize. So for processing thresholds, it is like your whole turnover, not just the turnover for Northern Ireland, that has to be one under 2 million. So it's your whole business entity that it needs to be under 2 million to be able to be a processor that's classed in that smaller processor category. Or then the only exceptions are going to be for the 5 processes which Shanker called out, the likes of animal feed, final use in hospitals, etc. Those ones there. So it's just because we've had some questions where they say, I only use under 2 million that remains in Northern Ireland. It is all of your financial turnover.
Yeah. And obviously the way inflation's been running recently, that number is diminished since the agreement has been made, and we're trying to talk to the UK and the EU about just that number. A question here just in terms of kind of confusion around where goods may end up, I suppose. So what happens if a company has goods not at risk because they're specifically staying in Northern Ireland or returning to GB, and goods that are at risk? How do we treat those differing scenarios? Many goods come in and we're unsure where they end up at first. So they're all at risk and apply the EU tariff or the UK tariff. So this is potentially one of those kind of scenarios around apportionment. I don't know whether we want to address that here now, but certainly in our conversations with HMRC, they have said that at this stage, there's no intention to remove the ability to apportion parts of your trade. Shanker, do you want to take that one?
Sure. So basically, if you're using apportionment now because you're a UKTS trader and you're doing on your declaration both not at risk and at risk, you can continue to do that. But just remember that the same rules that apply to apportionment before apply now. In other words, it's got to be a historic, 3 years or so of stable historical patterns of trading. It can't be changing dramatically. You need to know that. You need to be telling HMRC that you intend to use apportionment, and they need to approve it. So subject to all of those things being true, yes, you can continue to use it if you've been using it before. What I would say is for traders who look at all of this and say, well, I could be in that category and haven't been doing it, I would ask you to contact us in the TSS, and we'll walk through your specific case and decide what would be best for you.
Thanks, Shanker. Doreen, you like this question, so we'll give this one to you. Can the de minimis waiver be applied retrospectively?
Yes, and why I asked for that one to be brought up is because and again, this is listening to industry, and Shanker will give us a little smirk there in the background around this one, that we have been working with the HMRC and lobbying for the business to say that they have been using de minimis aid. What happens if they can prove their goods stayed in Northern Ireland? Or is there any financial benefit that they can get using a mix between de minimis aid and the duty reimbursement scheme? So what we have heard, and it's to be confirmed, is that there will be firm lines in this in October. And we are led to believe it is positive information. So it won't answer your question, can you apply it retrospectively? But you can change a declaration once it is closed using C285s. So if you have made an incorrect use of something, there always has been their ability to change the information post-closure. But however, you may, and again, this is a may, we may be able to give you positive news and confirm if you can use adjustments on your subsidy waiver and how that will be applied later on in the October period.
Okay, so there's more news to come on that.
Yep.
But there's indications of some positive news there at least.
Yes.
Yeah, I think it's moving in the right direction. But just bear in mind that it's a tricky one, because obviously if you've used your subsidy, you've used your subsidy, and it's hard to sort of put the toothpaste back in the tube in a sense. But I think people are very sympathetic to this situation for people, and I hope that, as Doreen says, we'll have good news very shortly.
Okay, the next question your colleagues have largely answered online, but it is about the need to continue to do supplementary declarations. So it's just about reinforcing the point.
Yep.
There are some changes now, 1st of October 2023, but actually there's other changes coming through in the 1st of October 2024. So between now and then the issue of the paperwork, the supplementary declarations where appropriate, isn't changing. So people just need to continue on as usual on those. Next question, we're a manufacturer of steel parts. Thus far, we've been using TARIC quota system for our at-risk imported steel in line with the guidance. We've been declaring goods not at risk on the supplementary declaration so that the correct duty is applied. Is this sufficient justification to declare our goods not at risk during the application process for UKIMS?
Do you want me to take this?
Yeah. Why don't you take it?
Okay. So
I just replied to it as well. Sorry, Doreen.
Okay.
So again, I'm going back to the point I made. It is with UKIMS, it's a trusted trader. So it's having that evidence that the goods remained in Northern Ireland is the key thing, whether it's steel or not. Now, if you're using a TRQ, you cannot use, and that's those category 7 and 17 steel movements, you cannot use UKIMS. However, if you're using steel categories outside of that, and you have that proof that the finished goods or the steel remains in Northern Ireland, then you can apply for UKIMS and you can get that benefit.
And I would add one thing to this. If you are, and this is not just steel TRQs, but all TRQs, if you are a trader where, because of the TRQ rule, you are not, you have to draw down the European TRQ, so you're in a situation where you have to either draw down multiple TRQs or you're drawing down your European TRQ for an internal customs territory movement, and that's creating a problem for you. In other words, you're getting to a point where the TRQ is used, and you're going to have to start paying the very high tariff that's beyond the TRQ rate. Let us know, because I think this is being monitored right now. The reason the steel 7 and 17 categories were sort of they didn't emerge out of nothing. They were responding to a real world problem that was occurring for people. So if there are other problems like this in the TRQ world, let us know, and we can start building a case as to why maybe this solution for 7 and 17 should be extended into other areas.
I can't reinforce enough how important that is. If there are issues, then we need to know them, because until there's real world evidence, then it's difficult to get things changed, shifted, moved, improved, etc., etc., etc. So yeah, I would really reinforce that comment. Rachel, you wanted to come in there on that as well, or is that Is Doreen and
No,
Shanker
Doreen
answer?
said exactly the same. It was just to say that I had replied to it as well. So it's all
Okay,
good.
that's great. The next one is, oh, excuse me. Yeah, this concept of one subsequent entity. Can we clarify what a subsequent entity may well be? So give us a practical example. And then just in answering the question, do they need to be in Northern Ireland or can they be GB located as well?
Do you want to take it, Shanker?
Yeah, I'll take that. I'm not sure whether the subsequent. I mean, the idea of the rule is to recognise the reality of the supply chain in that there are people who will be importing materials into Northern Ireland who then sell on to a processor, and so the normal, well, not the normal, the Northern Ireland Protocol rule on goods subject to processing. If I was such an importer and I was selling on to a processor, those goods are goods subject to processing, and therefore you would not be able to be on UKTS. You would not be able to make a not at risk declaration. And what this is recognising is simply the fact that you shouldn't be prevented from being on UKIMS, making a not at risk declaration, and even in the future being able to benefit from a simplified process for those goods simply because they are subject to processing. Now, it is only one entity. So if you're selling to somebody who's selling to somebody, and at some point in the supply chain there's a processing function, that will not get you out of the problem. But if it's one entity, in other words, you know who you're selling to, you know they're a processor, and you have to also demonstrate that the goods remain, the ultimate good is in Northern Ireland. So if you look at the animal feed example, for example, if you sell to a animal feed processor and all of their sales are to Northern Ireland facilities and the animal feed is being used in Northern Ireland facilities, then you would qualify for those materials you're bringing in. You would qualify for UKIMS. So partially it's to recognise the supply chain. It doesn't go beyond one entity, and that may create some difficulty for some people, but it is, I think, it is much better than the previous situation. And given our work for people who were applying for UKTS who were falling at this hurdle, the goods subject for processing, I think it should unlock the scheme for a fair number of people who wouldn't have been able to get on UKTS. And that underscores another point that we said in the seminar. If you've been rejected from UKTS on the grounds of this subject to processing, revisit what you were doing, because you may well qualify now.
So if I took a different example, so we have a very strong engineering sector here. They're here because we make great products, of course we do, but we're also here because we have a very good local supply chain. So you'll have primary producers of bits of machinery, for instance, that will be using local supply chains for components or semi-assemblies, etc., etc., etc. So say I am a part of the supply chain of one of those larger firms. I bring in a steel product, for instance. I turn that steel product into a component for one of those international sellers, but my customer is in Northern Ireland. My customer is in the next town along the motorway or wherever. I'm bringing product in, I'm processing it, but I'm selling it to someone in Northern Ireland. What are my responsibilities there at that point?
So let's say you're falling into the construction exemption because let's say that the product is being used in a facility, your steel product is being used in a facility. So you'd be claiming that exemption to as a processor exemption. You would have to provide evidence that the product remained in Northern Ireland, was used in a construction facility, and there are lots of ways of proving that that something has been basically used in a facility and used in a permanent permanent facility, you would have to provide some evidence of that. I think in our first UKIMS seminar, which is on the NICTA website, we did go into that particular evidence that you might need to provide in that case. We can certainly provide a link to that UKIMS webinar in the chat.
Yeah, I'm happy to step in here, Shanker, if I may. So even if we take it back a step to Stephen's example, so Stephen, you're manufacturing, I don't know, an axle I'm going to build into a flatbed trailer, okay? And that flatbed trailer may be sold on to somewhere else. Under the current rules, that would not qualify, even though that manufacturer of that trailer is within Northern Ireland, or even if it is, other mechanical pieces that are being created. So what we're looking at here is, even if you're not responsible for the end destination, you can still be authorised, but you need to make sure the goods still meet the not at risk requirement. And if you're not responsible for the end destination, so that's that one subsequent entity kind of thing, what kind of evidence they're looking for is a signed, written and signed declaration from your customer that you're selling to that the goods will remain in Northern Ireland. But if that's going on for further processing, they won't be able to do that because they'll be processing and selling on. Evidence that, via your commercial contracts, purchase orders, that kind of stuff, that the final use is in the UK. Or going back to the construction kind of example, it's evidence that the goods are to be permanently installed in the UK or fitted. So this is moving away from, it's an additional layer for that end use that I keep coming back to, is how do you demonstrate your goods remaining in the internal market if you're going to get the benefit when you move the goods into Northern Ireland? It's making sure it's end to end, that it's covered off. And again, it's just reinforcing that, and especially in the manufacturing industry, that you're very sure where those end products are going to finish up. And if you're not sure, well, then perhaps UKIMS can't be utilised, and exactly, won't be the most beneficial thing for your company to use. It may be more beneficial to look at the duty reimbursement scheme or other procedures.
Thanks, Doreen. I'm in the chat questions here now. I think some of this has been answered as part of the presentation and subsequent questions, but a question here from Jason Quinn. We expect to do turnover this year way above the 2 million threshold. A lot of that goes to the Republic of Ireland and the EU. It seems unfair that tariff will be applied whenever our goods are meant to freely circulate. But are there ways, I suppose, of circumventing that problem? So it maybe gives another opportunity to talk about potential tariff reimbursement, using de minimis waivers, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah.
Shanker, do you want to take that one?
Yeah, I mean, so all the ways that you could try to lower your tariff, exposure that applied in the Northern Ireland Protocol still apply. So as you said, if you've got, you can use your waiver, which is your allowable state aid, to cover off the tariff. Duty reimbursement requires you to have evidence that the goods ultimately stayed in Northern Ireland. So you may have some. You may not know about any of the goods in terms of knowledge that they stay in Northern Ireland at the point at which they move, but you may have evidence after they've moved that some remained in Northern Ireland. And in respect of those, provided you've got the requisite evidence, you can use the tariff, the duty reimbursement scheme to claim that back. So there are things that you can do in that case, but clearly a movement from GB to Ireland would attract full customs process and full EU applicable tariff, and that's what an at-risk movement, could be. So the best that can be done is to the best thing is to know that your goods are staying in the customs territory before they move. The second best thing is to know that they stayed in the customs territory before they move, and that'll give you some of the benefits of reimbursement. And there are people are very conscious, I think, in HMRC of the cash flow implications of having to rely on duty reimbursement versus knowing ahead of time that your goods stay in Northern Ireland. And there's some sympathy that sometimes that's quite difficult to know beforehand. And so while there are cash flow implications, I think we're working with HMRC to see if those can be minimized in some way, and hopefully we'll have some news on that, reasonably shortly.
And kind of one suggestion here from Jason and his is that actually it's about changing supply chains. Now, the intention of all of this work is to avoid the necessity to change supply chains, but and it seems to go a little way towards that, not all the way towards that, but obviously if goods are imported from Ireland or the EU directly to Northern Ireland, then this issue doesn't apply. This is specifically for goods that are distributed essentially from GB.
Yeah, and if I can build on that, so if the goods are going into the EU and not remaining in the internal market, there are other ways to offset duty. So if the goods are not GB origin coming in, well, and you can't use the preference under the TCA, well then, if the goods have been in free circulation previously in the EU, you can use returns goods relief as long as you have evidence. If the goods are being exported from Northern Ireland and not for the EU, again, you can claim your duty back. So it's not specifically just if the goods remain. If the goods actually are exported to non-EU countries, you can also claim that money back. So there is the TCA, there is returns goods relief, and then there's other methods that, again, we're happy to talk to on a one-to-one basis with, where you may not be aware of the availability of some offsetting duties to keep that cash flow up and to make the most of the trade coming into Northern Ireland.
And yeah, and then depending on what you're doing, you may be able to avail yourself of special customs procedures. So so those are very, very specific to the case. So I think what we probably encourage you to do is raise a case with TSS on your process, and we'll if it's complex, it'll get escalated up to IOE and ultimately this group. If it's more straightforward, it can be answered more quickly by a contact center agent. But I think if you've got a very specific question about your business model, then I think you probably need to get that into the TSS contact center.
Thanks, Shanker and Doreen. The question here where a GB-based distributor has advised that the goods are in free circulation in the UK, but it subsequently appears that the goods have a origin from a third country. Does the fact that the goods are in free circulation in the UK overrule those origin requirements at that point in time, allowing the business to use UKIMS to bring the goods to Northern Ireland from GB?
Okay, so there are a couple of different issues here that question implicates. So the first thing is, from a process standpoint, if it's in free circulation in GB, it will have cleared customs in GB. It would have cleared UK customs in order to come in to free circulation in GB. Therefore, from a process standpoint, the GB to Northern Ireland movement, that's a free circulation movement, and if you think that you can demonstrate that the goods stay in Northern Ireland in the usual way, you can definitely be on UKIMS. You should claim UKIMS. It allows you not to worry about what the applicable tariff should be. Now, if there are sufficient components from non-UK components such that the movement is effectively what's called a secondary movement, such that the European tariff might apply, and it might not be zero because of the rules of origin of the TCA. Then if you don't benefit from UKIMS, if it isn't a movement, if you aren't benefiting from the fact that it's an internal customs territory movement, you might be at risk on a potential tariff. So the easiest way, rather than having to wade through hundreds of pages of rules of origin language in the TCA, if you know that the goods are staying in the customs territory, is to be on UKIMS, because then this whole question of the applicable tariff simply doesn't apply.
Yeah, just to add that, Shanker, I did actually put a response. This was to the sort of response in the chat. So was this the specific question, Stephen, where the origin of goods was Taiwan?
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. So again, it's that there, as Shanker says, it's just that's not just as simple as two different questions within that. So it's, do they qualify under UKIMS? Yes, the goods are in free circulation as long as they're remaining. And because they're of Taiwan origin, is there additional duty? Well, if they were at risk, you couldn't claim preferential because they're coming from GB to Northern Ireland, but their origin is Taiwan. So it's two different things there to try and benefit from not paying any duty. So that's going back to my previous comments about utilising the trade agreements and preferential origin of goods as well. It's all very confusing. We do understand that.
Yeah, there's a problem in the UK's TCA around rules of origin that materialises itself only in Northern Ireland.
Yes.
Which needs resolved, that the Windsor Framework hasn't resolved. That includes for EU goods, never mind for rest of world goods. But
exactly,
that's a debate for another day. We've about five minutes left on this. Just a few more questions, if you don't mind. Doreen, I think you answered Bernadette's question there. Was on turnover size and the moving of goods, and some practice that she's currently engaging in her business is just suggesting is there something that has been missed that needs clarified?
Sorry, Stephen, I'm just scrolling through here. Yes, and again, it's the final product. So, you know, the turnover exceeds 2 million. You also are selling 70% into the EU. And again, it's that you're going to qualify. You're not going to qualify because you're over the 2 million threshold. But again, you wouldn't qualify again if you know at the time of movement that your goods are at risk. So 70% of your sales are at risk. Again, that is where we would reckon you're going to have to say that everything's at risk, unless, of course, as Shanker alluded to earlier, and Stephen quite nicely sneaked into the conversation, apportionment.
Yeah. Is beer food? That's almost like a personal question for me. Never mind a question from the audience, but it does seem confusing when there are ingredients and raw materials, and does that apply in this scenario?
This is a Christine Madeline question. I can bring them in.
Yes, beer is food.
Delighted. Can I count it as one of my 5 a day?
Yes, absolutely. And Guinness definitely counts as food.
That's good. I'm just going to quickly check the Q&A for others. As a manufacturer with a turnover over 2 million, bringing raw materials into Northern Ireland from GB, which are processed into final goods, some of which remain in Northern Ireland are not at risk. Can we use apportionment? Yes, is the short answer to that. And so as we've just briefly talked about, there are other tools available here. Apportionment, tariff reimbursement, de minimis waivers, returns good relief. Even if you can't use UKIMS, there are a number of other routes, some of which are complex, I accept, but there are a number of other routes where people can actually avoid any potential tariff risk should it exist. Some question here about guidance once you're actually established in UKIMS. Is there guidance available about how you actually use it from the 1st of October? So how do people once they're established go about actually claiming these benefits?
And again, in the slides that Shanker went through, I think it was the Linda slides. Again, it shows you if you were bringing the goods in and you were UKIMS registered and you were submitting your declaration, how to use the NI there to benefit from that. And then just to close that off, if you have declared the goods remaining in Northern Ireland using your UKIMS authorisation, you would also retain supporting evidence to prove the end use. Now that may be your sales invoice to your final customer in Northern Ireland, etc. But it's just retaining that information to produce it if you're asked to by HMRC.
Yeah, and the question here, just in terms of just I suppose is this question of people may sell stuff to Ireland even in a small amount. This applies.
Yeah.
This applies whether it's 1% or whether it's 100%. I think that's
it's
the
not.
kind of short
It's
answer.
not. Yeah, it's not. It's not the percentage that matters. What matters is the historical. That it's a pattern. That the pattern doesn't really shift very much historically. So if someone were to ask you or audit you and say and look at what was going to Ireland, what was going to staying in Northern Ireland, and it varies a lot from year to year, then apportionment is not an appropriate thing to use. But if the historical pattern is the same, it could be 1% staying in Northern Ireland, and you could benefit from apportionment for 1%.
Yep. Guys, I'm going to call a halt to it now because we're 90 minutes into the call. I think that's enough for most people. I think the kind of couple of messages here is that these are simplifications which are open now to many more businesses in Northern Ireland than when previously. The raising of the threshold from 500,000 to 2 million, HMRC estimate brings in about 80% of the manufacturing population in Northern Ireland, which is helpful. Even if you are bringing materials which is for consumption within your own facility, so they're not at risk, whether that's oil for machinery that you're using, whether it's spare parts, whether it's tea bags for the canteen, UKIMS could be for you. This isn't just a scheme for retail. This is a scheme for anybody who are moving goods into Northern Ireland. We will be sharing a recording and the slides of this. But the best bit of advice would be if you're unsure, if you're unclear, UK government's investing money in the Trader Support Service, the expertise of the people on this call and colleagues. Pick up the phone, raise a case, pick up the phone, talk through your scenario. Should there be an alternative route here in terms of avoiding potential economic harm to your business, then I'm sure Shanker, Doreen and all their colleagues will be very, very happy to help you discover what that is. Thanks everyone for joining us. Thank you, Shanker, Doreen, and other colleagues who interjected and answered questions in the background, which are incredibly helpful. And we'll see you again soon. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much.
Great, thanks all.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye.